When I pretended to be more sedated than I actually was, and overheard my 3 children discussing how to liquidate my assets before I even passed, I never imagined that 6 months later, I'd be sitting across from them in my lawyer's office as they learned they'd each inherited exactly $1, and that the rest of my $1.2 million estate had gone to the people who truly cared for me in my final years. A shocking truth that would teach my family the true meaning of legacy and love. Before we continue, if you're new here, make sure you subscribe, because tomorrow I'm sharing another family story that will leave you speechless. Now let's get back to it. This photo was taken at my 65th birthday party last year, 3 months before my accident. There's my eldest son, Michael, with his arm around me, my daughter Catherine beside him, and my youngest, David, taking the selfie. We're all smiling like the perfect family. What the camera didn't capture was Michael asking if I'd considered downsizing from my 4-bedroom colonial on 2 acres, the home where I'd raised them after their father died when they were still in elementary school. "Mom, that house is just too much for you to handle alone," he'd said, his financial advisor voice slipping into what I called his talking to mother tone. "Think of the property taxes, the maintenance. You could buy something smaller, bank. The difference, maybe even help the grandkids with college." My mother used to say, "Children will show you who they are long before they show you what they want." She was right, but I hadn't been paying attention to the signs. The casual questions about my will from Catherine, David's sudden interest in my investment portfolio, their constant reminders of how much they'd helped me after their father passed, as if tallying debts I'd need to repay. I'd spent 30 years as a high school English teacher before retiring 5 years ago. I'd lived modestly, saved diligently, paid off my mortgage early. The house that Robert and I bought for $145,000 in 1983 was now worth close to $1 million in our charming New England town. My pension, investments, and Robert's life insurance had left me financially secure, a fact my children seemed increasingly interested in. The day everything changed began simply. I was tending to my heirloom tomatoes, a retirement passion. The wooden steps to my back porch had been deteriorating, and I'd asked Michael repeatedly to help me replace them. "I'll get to it, Mom," he'd say, though he never seemed too busy for his weekend golf trips. That afternoon, as I carried a basket of tomatoes up those neglected stairs, the bottom step gave way. I fell badly, my hip taking the impact. Despite the pain, I managed to call 911. I didn't call my children first, a decision they later cited as evidence of my cognitive decline. The next few days passed in a blur of surgeries, pain medication, and hospital rooms. When I was lucid, I noticed my children huddled in corners, speaking in hushed tones. Catherine took control of communication with the doctors, often talking about me as if I weren't there. "She can't possibly return to that house," she told my orthopedic surgeon. "Those stairs alone would be impossible. We're thinking an assisted living facility would be best." This was the first I'd heard of such plans. On the 4th day after my surgery, when the pain was still significant but my mind clearer, all 3 entered my room with an air of purpose. Michael carried a leather portfolio containing documents. David fidgeted nervously. Catherine's smile seemed rehearsed. "Mom," Michael began, "we've found a solution. Cedar Grove Assisted Living has an opening. It's beautiful, and they can take you as soon as you're discharged." "And what about my house?" I asked, already suspecting their answer. "That's what we need to discuss," he continued, opening the portfolio. "We think the most practical solution is to sell it. The market's hot right now, and the proceeds would easily cover Cedar Grove for many years," Catherine added, her voice silky with concern. "Mom, you always said you never wanted to be a burden. This way you won't have to worry about anything." David at least looked uncomfortable. "We just want what's best for you, Mom." Michael removed several documents from his portfolio. "We've prepared everything. A power of attorney so we can handle the sale and your finances while you recover, and a deed transfer, just to simplify things. The nurse can witness your signature. I noticed the timing wasn't accidental. They'd arrived right after my pain medication, when the nurses expected I would be at my most compliant. I'm feeling pretty tired now, I said, allowing my eyelids to droop. Could you leave those with me? I'll look at them when I'm more alert. They exchanged glances that spoke volumes. No rush, Mom, Michael said too quickly. We'll just leave them here, but the sooner we get this sorted, the sooner we can secure your spot at Cedar Grove. They thought I was asleep when they continued their discussion at the foot of my bed. We need to move on this quickly, Michael insisted. If she goes back to that house, we'll never get her out. What about Margaret? Catherine asked, referring to my sister. She's going to raise hell if she thinks we're pushing Mom into anything. Auntie, Margaret doesn't get a vote, Michael replied. Besides, once the house is sold, it's done. David's voice was hesitant. Guys, are we sure this is what Mom would want? I mean, she loves that house. She's 65 with a broken hip, David, Catherine snapped. What she wants and what she needs are two different things. Besides, did you see the estimate for the renovations to make that place accessible? It would eat up a huge chunk of her savings. Speaking of which, Michael lowered his voice further, but not enough. We should talk about the investment accounts too. If we're her financial POAs, we should consider rebalancing her portfolio, something more conservative. And more liquid, Catherine added meaningfully. I lay perfectly still, my heart racing despite the medication slowing my body. These were my children, plotting to strip me of my independence and assets while I lay in a hospital bed. In that moment, something fundamental shifted in my understanding of my family. I knew then that I needed to protect myself, even from the people who should have been protecting me. The next morning, when they returned expectantly, I was sitting, up in bed, fully alert. The documents remained untouched. I've been thinking about your suggestion, I told them calmly. And I've decided I'll be returning to my home after rehabilitation. My friend Eleanor has offered to stay with me until I'm back on my feet. The shock on their faces would have been comical if it hadn't been so painful. Mom, that's not practical, Michael began, shifting into his authoritative stance. Nevertheless, it's my decision, I replied firmly. And I won't be signing any documents until I've had my own lawyer review them. Catherine's face flushed. Your lawyer? Mom, we're your family. We're trying to help you. Yes, my lawyer, I repeated. The same one who helped me update my will last year. It was a small lie. I hadn't updated my will since Robert died. But the flicker of concern that passed between them told me everything I needed to know. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to rest before my physical therapy, I said, closing my eyes to signal the end of our conversation. That afternoon, I asked a nurse to help me make 2 calls, one to my sister Margaret and another to Robert's best friend, James Wilson, who had remained close to me after my husband's death and who, fortunately, was a retired estate attorney. The battle for my independence and my legacy had begun. The morning after I made those phone calls, my hospital room door burst open to reveal my sister Margaret, 5'2" of pure determination, her silver bob swinging as she marched in carrying an overnight bag and what appeared to be a stack of legal books. Charlotte Wilson, she announced, loud enough for half the floor to hear. I'm here, and those vultures better watch out. My sister had never been one for subtlety. Behind her came James Wilson, Robert's best friend and my most trusted confidant since becoming a widow. At 70, James still had the commanding presence that had served him well during his 40 years as an attorney. These two witnessing my children's behavior was like watching a nature documentary where predators suddenly realize they're being observed. Michael, Catherine, and David arrived minutes later, clearly surprised to find my room already occupied. Aunt Margaret, Michael recovered quickly, leaning in for a hug that my sister sidestepped. We didn't know you were coming. Clearly, Margaret replied, arranging flowers she'd brought while giving them a look that could wilt steel. Charlotte called me yesterday. Seems there's been some confusion about her future living arrangements. Catherine's gaze darted to the document still sitting untouched on my bedside table. We're just trying to help Mom transition to a more suitable living situation. James stepped forward, extending his hand. James Wilson. I was Robert's best friend for 40 years. His tone was pleasant, but his eyes were assessing. Charlotte has asked me to review any legal documents before she signs them. That's really not necessary, Michael began, his financial advisor's smile firmly in place. This is just family taking care of family. Then you won't mind if another family friend looks things over, James replied, his hand still extended. The uncomfortable silence that followed spoke volumes. Michael finally shook James's hand, his grip visibly tighter than necessary. Over the next hour, I watched James methodically review the documents my children had prepared, his expression growing increasingly troubled. Meanwhile, Margaret helped me eat the lunch she'd brought from my favorite deli, a small act of normalcy that nearly brought me to tears. Charlotte, James finally said, removing his reading glasses, I strongly advise against signing any of these documents. He turned to my children. This power of attorney grants extremely broad authority with minimal oversight. The property transfer effectively surrenders Charlotte's major asset without any guaranteed benefit to her, and there's no provision for her to change her mind once she's signed. David at least had the decency to look embarrassed. Catherine's face flushed with anger. Michael remained impassive. We're her children, Catherine insisted. Who better to look after her interests? That's precisely what troubles me, James replied calmly. If your motives are purely to protect your mother, you should welcome a more balanced approach, one that safeguards her assets while still giving her autonomy over her own life. The room crackled with tension. I'd spent decades as a high school teacher breaking up conflicts before they escalated, and I recognized when a situation was about to boil over. I think we all need some time to consider what's best, I interjected. Michael, Catherine, David, I appreciate your concern, but I won't be signing anything today. I met each of their eyes in turn. I raised you to think critically and act ethically. I hope you'll remember those lessons now. After they left, Margaret sat beside me, taking my hand in hers. Charlotte, what happened? You've always said your children were the greatest blessing in your life. My eyes filled with tears I'd been holding back. I don't know, Maggie. When did my becoming older translate to becoming incapable? When did my assets become their inheritance rather than my security? The hurt was so profound I could physically feel it in my chest. I heard them talking when they thought I was asleep. They're not just concerned about my welfare, they're planning how to access my money. James sat on my other side. Unfortunately, I've seen this happen many times. Adult children start viewing their parents' assets as their future inheritance rather than their parents' current security. They convince themselves they're acting in your best interest because it aligns with their desires. What should I do? I asked, feeling more vulnerable than I had in decades. James's expression was gentle but resolute. First, we need to secure your legal protection. I'd like to draft a new power of attorney naming Margaret as your agent, with specific limitations, to protect your autonomy. Second, we need to ensure you can return to your home safely after rehabilitation. And third, Margaret added, her eyes gleaming with the mischief I recognized from our childhood, we need to teach those kids of yours a lesson they won't forget. Over the next week, we enacted our plan. James helped me create a new estate plan that reflected my true wishes, not the ones my children presumed I had. Margaret coordinated with my network of friends, fellow retired teachers, neighbors, and community members I'd known for decades, to arrange for modifications to my home and a schedule of visitors once I returned. What my children didn't know was how deeply connected I was to my community. The contractor who agreed to install a wheelchair ramp at cost was the father of a former student. The retired nurse who volunteered to check on me daily had been my classroom neighbor for 15 years. The Meals on Wheels coordinator was in my book club. By the time I was discharged to a rehabilitation facility, everything was in motion. My children visited less frequently, clearly regrouping after their initial plan had been thwarted. When they did visit, they brought forced cheerfulness and thinly veiled suggestions about reconsidering my decision. "Mom," Catherine said during one such visit, "I've been researching in-home care, and it's incredibly expensive. It just makes more financial sense to sell the house." "I appreciate your concern," I replied, "but my finances are being handled." Their expressions whenever I mentioned James or my new arrangements ranged from confusion to outright alarm. They'd clearly underestimated both my resolve and my resources. The true confrontation came the day before my scheduled return home. All three arrived at the rehabilitation center together, their unified front a clear warning sign. "Mom," Michael began, his tone serious, "we need to discuss your cognitive state." My heart raced, but I kept my expression neutral. "My cognitive state?" Catherine nodded, her face a mask of concern. "We've been talking to your doctors. Your decision-making since the fall has been concerning. First refusing Cedar Grove, then bringing in Dad's old friend to interfere with family decisions. Now, this plan to return to a house you can't possibly navigate safely. We're worried you might be experiencing some early dementia," Michael added, his voice softer now. "It's common after physical trauma, especially at your age." I nearly laughed at the transparency of it. Having failed to convince me to sign over my assets willingly, they were now attempting to declare me incompetent. "That's quite an accusation," I said calmly. "Especially since my doctors have found no cognitive impairment whatsoever." I reached for the folder Margaret had left with me. In fact, I had a comprehensive cognitive assessment just yesterday. I handed Michael the report James had insisted I obtain. "You'll find I scored above average for my age group on all measures." The look that passed between them would have broken my heart if it hadn't already been cracked by their behavior. "You knew," David said quietly. "You knew what we were going to say." "I raised you," I replied simply. "I know how you think. What I don't know is when you started viewing me as an obstacle rather than your mother." Michael's expression hardened. "This isn't fair. We're trying to protect you." "No," I interrupted, surprising even myself with the steel in my voice. "You're trying to control me and my assets. There's a difference." I took a deep breath. "I've made arrangements for my care and my legal affairs. I'll be returning to my home tomorrow as planned." Catherine's composure finally cracked. "With what money? How are you paying for all these modifications and care without touching your investments?" The question revealed more than she intended. They'd been monitoring my accounts, waiting for withdrawals that would signal financial strain. Strain they could use to push their agenda forward. "I have resources you don't know about," I said, which was partly true. My retirement plan had multiple components, and James had helped me access funds without depleting my primary investments. But more importantly, I have something money can't buy: people who care about me without eyeing my bank account. The words hung in the air between us, a truth too painful to acknowledge but impossible to ignore. David, always the most sensitive of my children, looked stricken. "Mom, that's not fair. We do care about you." "I want to believe that," I said softly. "But your actions tell a different story." I squared my shoulders, channeling the authority I'd wielded in classrooms for 3 decades. "I'll be going home tomorrow. You're welcome to visit, as my children, not my financial advisors or healthcare proxies. If you can't accept those terms, then I think we need some time apart." They left in a cloud of indignation and hurt feelings. As the door closed behind them, I felt a curious mixture of sorrow and liberation. The children I'd raised had revealed a side of themselves I'd never wanted to see, but acknowledging that truth had somehow set me free from the obligation to pretend. That night, I made the decision that would ultimately lead to those shocked faces in the lawyer's office 6 months later, a decision about legacy, love, and lessons that sometimes can only be taught through consequences. Returning home after 6 weeks away was like breathing for the first time after being underwater. Despite my limited mobility, the feeling of crossing my own threshold, sleeping in my own bed, and making tea in my own kitchen restored something essential that had been slipping away in the sterile environments of the hospital and rehabilitation center. My home had been transformed to accommodate my recovery. The back steps were replaced with a gently sloping ramp. Grab bars had been installed in the bathroom. A comfortable hospital bed had been set up in the downstairs study to eliminate the need for climbing stairs. These modifications, organized by Margaret and implemented by friends and community members, allowed me to maintain my independence while healing. For the first week, my children stayed away. No calls, no visits, no text messages. It was the longest we'd gone without communication since they'd left for college, and the silence echoed through my days like a physical presence. I'd expected anger, perhaps even threats, but this cold withdrawal hurt in ways I hadn't anticipated. Eleanor, my oldest friend and fellow retired teacher, stopped by with groceries and stayed for tea. "Have you heard from any of them?" she asked, arranging flowers in a vase by the window. "Not a word," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think they're waiting for me to struggle and call them for help." Eleanor's expression hardened. She'd known my children since they were in diapers. "After Robert died, you put your entire life on hold to make sure they were okay. 17 years old, and you never missed a school event. Never let them see how broken you were. You deserve better than this, Charlotte." Her words unlocked something I'd been holding back. The deep, searing hurt of being viewed as a resource rather than a person by the 3 humans I loved most in the world. I wept as I hadn't allowed myself to do since discovering their plans. Eleanor's arms around my shoulders as decades of maternal sacrifice crashed against the shore of filial betrayal. When the tears finally subsided, something had changed. The grief remained, but alongside it grew a steely resolve. "I need to make some changes to my will," I said, reaching for the phone. James arrived the next morning, leather portfolio in hand, so different from Michael's that day in the hospital. We sat in my sunny kitchen while he outlined options for my estate. "You could disinherit them completely," he suggested. "But the courts sometimes overturn such actions, especially if your children contest the will claiming undue influence from others." "I don't want to leave them nothing," I replied, surprising myself with the certainty. Despite everything, they're still my children. I just want them to understand what they nearly lost. Not just my assets, but our relationship. James nodded thoughtfully. "There's a strategy I've seen work in situations like this. It's sometimes called the disinheritance with acknowledgement approach." He explained how I could leave each child a nominal amount, often $1, with specific language acknowledging that this was an intentional decision, not an oversight. The bulk of my estate could then be directed elsewhere. But where would it go? I wondered aloud. "I don't want to leave everything to Margaret. That would just confirm their suspicions that she manipulated me against them." We discussed various options, charities, scholarships, distant relatives. None felt right until James mentioned a trust. "You could establish a trust with specific conditions for distribution. This would allow you to leave substantial assets to your children, but with guidelines for how and when they receive the funds." The seed of an idea took root. What if the trust wasn't just about money, but about the values I'd tried to instill in my children? What if I could create a legacy that taught rather than merely transferred wealth? Over the next month, as my physical healing progressed, James helped me craft a comprehensive estate plan. My children remained distant, though they'd progressed to occasional brief text messages asking about my health. Their retreat felt like a pressure tactic, a way to isolate me until I reconsidered my stance. They didn't realize I'd spent the past 30 years in high school classrooms. I recognized manipulation when I saw it. Margaret, who had returned to her home in Vermont but called daily, was blunt in her assessment. "They're waiting you out, Char. They think you'll get lonely and cave." She wasn't wrong. There were moments, particularly in the evening when the house grew quiet, when I nearly picked up the phone. The mother in me wanted to bridge the gap, to reassure them that despite our conflict, my love remained unchanged. But the woman who had heard them plotting while she lay medicated needed to hold the line. Then came the incident that crystallized my resolve. One rainy Tuesday, about 2 months after my return home, I received a call from Janice, a teller at my local bank branch where I'd done business for over 20 years. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm calling because something unusual happened today," she began hesitantly. "Your son Michael came in asking for information about your accounts. He said he was handling your finances during your recovery and needed statements for tax purposes." My blood ran cold. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing, of course," Janice replied. "Bank policy prevents us from disclosing information without authorization, but he was quite insistent, even showed some document claiming power of attorney. When I told him it wasn't in our system, he became frustrated. I thanked her for the call and immediately contacted James. By that evening, we had placed fraud alerts on all my accounts and notified my financial institutions about potential unauthorized access attempts. James also suggested I document the incident in case I needed evidence of my children's actions later. The next day, I received an unexpected visitor. David, my youngest, stood on my front porch looking uncomfortable and slightly disheveled, so different from his usual polished appearance. When Eleanor showed him into the living room, the contrast between my son's hesitancy and my friend's protective hovering spoke volumes about how much had changed. "Mom," he began, perching on the edge of the sofa as if ready for a quick escape. "I wanted to check on you, to see how you're doing." The simple courtesy, something that would have been unremarkable before, now felt charged with subtext. "I'm recovering well," I replied carefully. "The home modifications have made a significant difference." An awkward silence stretched between us. Eleanor, after ensuring I was comfortable, retreated to the kitchen, close enough to intervene if needed, but giving us privacy for this difficult conversation. "Is there something specific you wanted to discuss, David?" I finally asked. He looked down at his hands. "Michael sent me." The admission clearly cost him. "He wants to know if you've made any decisions about financial matters." The transparency of it was almost refreshing after months of manipulation. "You mean, have I reconsidered signing over my assets to you and your siblings?" David winced. "Mom, it's not like that." "Then what is it like?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle despite the anger simmering beneath. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks very much like 3 adults trying to pressure their mother into surrendering her financial independence while she's physically vulnerable. We're worried about you," he insisted, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine. "David," I said softly, "I want you to think carefully. If your father were still alive, would you be having this conversation with him? Would you be questioning his ability to manage his own affairs because of a broken hip?" The question hit its mark. Robert had been revered by our children, his judgment never questioned even as he aged. The double standard was suddenly laid bare between us. "That's different," David protested weakly. "Because he was a man? Because he worked in business rather than education? Or because you respected him in a way you don't respect me?" My son had no answer, and in his silence I heard everything I needed to know. Please tell Michael that I'm not making any changes to my financial arrangements, I said firmly. And David, next time you want to check on me, come because you care, not because you've been sent to gather intelligence. After he left, I sat in my garden despite the chill, watching birds at the feeder Robert had built decades ago. The visiting chickadees took only what they needed, never trying to prevent others from accessing the seeds. Even in nature, there seemed to be lessons my children had missed. That evening, I finalized my estate plans with a clarity and purpose that had been building since that day in the hospital. The new will and trust documents were comprehensive, reflecting not just the distribution of assets, but the values I hoped would outlive me. James had done a masterful job translating my intentions into legally binding language. "Are you sure about this?" he asked as I signed the final documents. "It's a significant departure from your previous arrangements." "I've never been more certain," I replied. "Sometimes the greatest gift we can give our children isn't what they want, but what they need." The weight that lifted from my shoulders after signing those papers was immense. For the first time since my fall, I slept through the night without waking to anxiety. Whatever happened next, I had protected myself and created a legacy that reflected my true wishes, not the expectations others had placed upon me. 1 week later, Catherine called. Her tone was conciliatory, almost warm, a dramatic shift from our last interaction. "Mom, we're thinking of having a family dinner this Sunday. Just the 4 of us, like old times. Would you be up for that?" The timing wasn't coincidental. Tax documents had recently been mailed, and my children would have noticed they were no longer listed as beneficiaries on certain accounts. This sudden olive branch had the distinct scent of strategy rather than sincere reconciliation. "Sunday would be lovely," I replied, deciding to meet their move with one of my own. "But why don't we do it here? I'm much more mobile now, and I've been wanting to show you all the modifications to the house." Catherine hesitated just long enough to confirm my suspicions. "Sure, Mom. That sounds great. What can we bring?" "Just yourselves," I said pleasantly, "and perhaps an open mind." As I hung up, I knew Sunday would be a turning point. They were coming with expectations, to assess my situation, to renew their campaign for control, perhaps even to search for financial documents while visiting. Instead, they would find a mother reclaiming her narrative and redefining the terms of our relationship. What none of us realized then was that Sunday dinner would set in motion the final act of our family drama, one that would culminate in that lawyer's office where the true meaning of legacy would finally be revealed. Sunday arrived with perfect fall weather, crisp, clear, and brilliantly sunny. I spent the morning cooking family recipes: Robert's famous pot roast, garlic mashed potatoes made the way my mother had taught me, and apple crisp with fruit from the tree in my backyard. The familiar rhythms of chopping, stirring, and seasoning were therapeutic, connecting me to generations of women in my family who had expressed love through nourishment. Eleanor had helped me set the dining room table with my good china, the EI set Robert and I had received for our wedding and used for every significant family occasion since. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, straightening a napkin with unnecessary precision. "I could stay, or at least be on call if things get tense." "I need to do this alone," I replied, though the offer was tempting. "They're my children, and this is between us now." After Eleanor left, I made one final check of the house. The ramp and grab bars were visible evidence of my determination to stay independent. The dining room sideboard held framed family photos spanning decades, tangible reminders of our shared history. And in my study, locked in the desk drawer, lay copies of my new estate documents, ready if needed. Michael arrived first, punctual as always. He carried an expensive bottle of wine and a formal bouquet that looked purchased from the grocery store on the way over. Beautiful, but impersonal. "Mom, you look well," he said, embracing me with careful distance, as if I might break. His eyes scanned the house, noting the modifications with barely concealed disapproval. Catherine and David arrived together 15 minutes later. Catherine brought a bakery cheesecake despite knowing I'd always make dessert for family dinners. David carried nothing but shuffled uncomfortably in the entryway as if unsure of his welcome. "The house smells amazing," David offered, the first genuine comment of the afternoon. "Thank you for hosting, Mom," Catherine added, her smile professional. "We weren't sure you'd be up to cooking just yet." The subtext was clear. They'd expected, perhaps hoped, to find me struggling, reinforcing their narrative about my inability to care for myself. Instead, they found the house spotless, a complete meal prepared, and their mother moving with increasing comfort, despite the cane I still needed for longer distances. "I've had time to adapt," I said simply, leading them to the dining room. Amazing what one can accomplish with the right support. Dinner began with strained conversation about safe topics: the weather, a recent local sports victory, Catherine's daughter's dance recital. The familiar food seemed to soften something in them, or perhaps it was just the powerful pull of childhood memories associated with these dishes. By the time we reached the main course, the atmosphere had warmed slightly. "This is Dad's roast," David said suddenly, his fork paused midway to his mouth. "I'd forgotten how it tastes." "Your father made it better," I admitted. "He always claimed there was a secret ingredient, but he never told me what it was. I think he just enjoyed having a mystery." For a moment, we were just a family sharing memories of a loved one. Michael smiled fondly. He used to say the secret ingredient was time and patience, which drove me crazy as a kid. I thought he was being philosophical, but later I realized he was probably talking about the actual cooking process. "That sounds like Dad," Catherine agreed, her professional veneer cracking slightly. I looked at my children, really looked at them, and saw flashes of the people they'd been before money and property entered our relationship. Michael, with his father's analytical mind. Catherine, with my determination. David, with his father's gentle heart hidden behind self-consciousness. "I miss him every day," I said quietly. "He would have been so proud of all of you, your careers, your families, but most of all, how you've supported each other through the years." Something shifted in the room, a barely perceptible tightening. They exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between siblings who'd once been allies in childhood adventures, but were now conspirators in adult schemes. Michael cleared his throat. "Speaking of support, Mom, that's partly why we wanted to have dinner tonight. We've been talking and we realize we approached things poorly after your accident." "We were worried," Catherine added quickly. "But we should have consulted you more directly about our concerns rather than making arrangements without your full involvement." "It came from a place of love," David said, his voice soft, but his eyes not quite meeting mine. The apology was carefully constructed, acknowledging the approach but not the intent. They weren't sorry for trying to take control of my assets, just sorry for how they'd gone about it. "I appreciate that," I said, choosing my words with the precision I'd once used in parent-teacher conferences when delivering difficult news. "It's important that we understand each other going forward." Michael took this as an opening. "Exactly. We want to help you think through your long-term plans. The house is worth so much now, and the maintenance will only become more challenging. We could help you find a wonderful condo or—" "I'm not selling my home, Michael," I interrupted gently but firmly. "Mom, be reasonable," Catherine said, her tone slipping back into condescension. "You can't handle this place indefinitely. The stairs, the yard, the costs." "I've addressed the physical challenges," I replied. "The financial ones are not your concern." "But they are our concern," Michael insisted, his financial advisor persona emerging. "We've looked at your retirement accounts. With today's longevity and healthcare costs, you could outlive your savings, especially if you maintain this property." The casual mention that they'd been monitoring my finances, information they had no right to access, hung in the air between us. How exactly did you look at my retirement accounts? I asked, my voice deceptively calm. A flicker of realization crossed Michael's face as he recognized his mistake. Dad left some statements. We were just trying to get a full picture. I see, I said, setting down my fork. And did your full picture include attempting to access my bank accounts last week? Or preparing documents for me to sign while I was on pain medication? Or discussing how to liquidate my assets while I lay in a hospital bed pretending to be asleep? The silence that followed was absolute. Their faces registered different versions of the same shock. The realization that I knew far more than they'd assumed. You were awake, Catherine finally whispered. Yes, I confirmed. I heard everything. Your concerns about Margaret intervening, your plans for my investments, your eagerness to sell this house before I could return to it. David looked genuinely distressed. Mom, it wasn't like that. It was exactly like that, I countered. And it has forced me to confront something I never wanted to acknowledge. That the three people I love most in this world see me primarily as an asset to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Michael attempted to recover. That's not fair. We've always had your best interests at heart. My best interests, I repeated. Or your inheritance? The word landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of discomfort across all their faces. Is that what this is about? Catherine asked, her voice tight. You're punishing us by threatening our inheritance? The naked concern about money rather than our fractured relationship confirmed everything I'd feared. This isn't about punishment, I said quietly. This is about recognizing who people truly are and responding accordingly. I rose from the table and walked to my study, returning with 3 sealed envelopes. I placed one before each of my children. What are these? Michael asked, not reaching for his. Letters I've written to each of you, I explained. About love, legacy, and lessons I hope you'll carry forward. I'd like you to read them in private after you leave today. Catherine's hand hovered over her envelope. Mom, you're being dramatic. We can work this out. I hope we can, I replied sincerely. But first, we need to be honest about what's happened. You saw an opportunity when I was vulnerable and tried to exploit it for financial gain. That changes things between us, whether we want it to or not. So, you are changing your will, Michael said flatly. His focus on the financial implications rather than the broken trust was all the confirmation I needed. I've made arrangements that reflect my values and the relationships as they currently exist, I answered. Beyond that, I don't think my estate planning is an appropriate topic for Sunday dinner. An uncomfortable silence settled over the table. The half-eaten food had grown cold. The celebration of family connection evaporated. I think it's time for us to go, Catherine finally said, her voice brittle. She stood, gathering her purse. Thank you for dinner. Michael followed with similar stiff courtesy. Only David lingered, conflict evident in his expression. Mom, I never wanted any of this to happen, he said softly. I know, I replied and meant it. Of my 3 children, David had shown the most reluctance, the most awareness of the ethical boundaries being crossed. That's why I have hope for us, David. But reconciliation requires honesty first. After they left, I sat alone in my dining room surrounded by the remnants of our failed attempt at normal family dinner. The good china that had witnessed decades of celebrations now bore witness to perhaps our most honest and painful interaction as a family. I gathered the untouched envelopes they had left behind. Their refusal to take them was telling. They weren't ready to hear what I had to say. Not yet. That night, Margaret called for her usual check-in. How did it go? She asked, intuition coloring, her voice with concern. About as well as could be expected, I replied, suddenly exhausted. They're still focused on the money, Maggie, not on what their actions did to our relationship. My sister's sigh carried decades of insight. Some lessons can't be taught with words alone, Charlotte. Sometimes people need to experience consequences. I know, I said quietly, but it breaks my heart that it's come to this. In the weeks that followed, communication from my children dwindled to occasional perfunctory text messages. The holidays approached, traditionally a time when our family gathered for extended celebrations. This year, the invitations never came. I sent each of my children a card with the envelope from the dinner enclosed inside, along with a simple note: "When you're ready to talk, I'm here. With love always, Mom." Christmas passed in quiet celebration, with Margaret, James, Eleanor, and other friends who had become my support system. New Year's brought reflection on how dramatically my life had changed in 12 months, not just physically from the accident, but emotionally from the painful recognition of my children's priorities. Then, in early February, came the call that would start the final chapter of our family's reckoning. It was James, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Charlotte, I've been contacted by Michael's attorney. They're requesting a formal meeting regarding your estate plans. It seems they may be preparing to challenge your competency to manage your own affairs." The depth of their determination to control my assets was breathtaking. Even after everything, I hadn't anticipated they would go this far. "What do we do?" I asked, a calm settling over me that felt almost like acceptance. "We meet them on our terms," James replied. "With all the documentation of your competency, with your doctor's statements, and with your estate plans fully executed and legally unassailable." "And then?" I pressed. James's voice softened. "And then they learn exactly what their actions have cost them." The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in mid-March at James's office. The timing felt appropriate. Tax season, when thoughts turned to finances and futures. The winter had been long and isolating, with only occasional updates from Michael about paperwork they needed to discuss. No mention was made of the legal challenge James had warned me about, though we had prepared exhaustively for that possibility. By then, my physical recovery was nearly complete. I still used a cane for longer walks, but around the house I moved, freely. The hip that had started this entire saga had healed, though the relationship with my children remained fractured. The morning of the meeting, I dressed with deliberate care. A tailored navy suit I'd worn to professional conferences. Pearl earrings Robert had given me on our 25th anniversary, sensible but elegant low heels. My appearance needed to project exactly what I was: competent, composed, and completely capable of managing my own affairs. Margaret arrived to drive me, her protective instincts on full display. "You don't have to do this, Charlotte. James could handle it without you present." "I need to be there," I replied, checking my reflection one last time. "They need to see me, really see me, not the vulnerable patient or incompetent elder they've constructed in their minds." James's office occupied the top floor of a historic building downtown, with gleaming wood paneling and discreet displays of his legal credentials. He met us in the reception area, his expression reassuring. "They're already here," he said quietly. "All three of them, plus their attorney from Bergman and Associates." "They hired Bernard Bergman?" Margaret interjected, her eyebrows rising. "That's a high-powered estate litigation firm." James nodded. "They're clearly prepared for a fight. Are you sure you want to proceed, Charlotte?" I straightened my shoulders, feeling the weight of the moment. "Absolutely." The conference room fell silent as I entered. My children sat on one side of a long mahogany table, a distinguished silver-haired man in an expensive suit beside them. Their expressions ranged from Michael's controlled neutrality to Catherine's barely concealed hostility to David's obvious discomfort. "Mrs. Wilson," the silver-haired man rose, extending his hand. "Bernard Bergman, thank you for joining us." "Ms. Wilson," I corrected gently. I had returned to my professional title after Robert died, a small but significant reclamation of identity. I understand you're representing my children in some matter concerning my estate. The directness seemed to surprise him. He glanced at Michael before responding. Yes, there are some concerns about recent changes to your estate planning that we'd like to discuss. James guided me to a seat at the head of the table, positioning himself protectively at my right while Margaret sat at my left. The physical arrangement wasn't lost on anyone. My children and their attorney on one side, my support system on the other, and me at the position of authority. Before we begin, James said, opening his portfolio, I'd like to establish some facts for the record. Ms. Wilson has undergone comprehensive cognitive and psychological evaluations with 3 separate specialists. He slid copies of reports across the table. As you can see, all have confirmed she is fully competent to make her own financial, medical, and legal decisions. Bernard Bergman scanned the documents, his expression revealing nothing. These evaluations were conducted after the changes to Ms. Wilson's estate planning, correct? Both before and after, James clarified. The first was done during her rehabilitation, specifically to address her children's expressed concerns about her decision-making capacity. The others were completed afterward as additional precaution. I studied my children's faces as this information was shared. They hadn't known about all the evaluations. Catherine looked particularly frustrated, as if a carefully constructed argument was crumbling before she could even present it. Furthermore, James continued, we have documentation of concerning incidents that suggest the real issue isn't Ms. Wilson's competence, but rather attempts by her children to gain control of her assets against her wishes. He outlined the hospital incident where they'd brought documents while I was on pain medication, Michael's unauthorized attempt to access my bank accounts, and their repeated pressure to sell my home. The clinical recitation of facts stripped of emotion somehow made their actions seem even more calculating. David couldn't maintain eye contact. Catherine's jaw tightened defensively. Michael remained impassive, though a muscle twitched in his cheek, a tell he'd had since childhood when he was restraining anger. Bernard Bergman shifted strategies smoothly. My clients have expressed genuine concern about their mother's well-being and financial security. Perhaps there have been some miscommunications, but their intentions were protective, not exploitative. It was time for me to speak. Mr. Bergman, with all due respect, I was a teacher for 30 years. I can recognize the difference between protection and control. I turned to face my children directly. I heard you in the hospital discussing how to liquidate my investments. Not for my care, but for your access. Michael started to object, but I raised my hand slightly, the same gesture I'd used in classrooms to maintain order. Surprisingly, it still worked. I'm not angry anymore, I continued, my voice steady. I'm disappointed and sad, because somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as your mother and started seeing me as a portfolio to be managed. Bernard Bergman attempted to redirect. Perhaps we could focus on the specific changes to Ms. Wilson's estate plan that concern my clients. They were, until recently, the primary beneficiaries of their mother's will, an arrangement that reflected decades of family understanding, James nodded. Ms. Wilson has authorized me to disclose the general structure of her new estate plan, though the specific details remain private unless contested in court. He removed a document from his portfolio. Ms. Wilson has established the Wilson Family Legacy Trust with the following provisions. He proceeded to outline the structure I had created with his guidance. A trust that would distribute funds to my children based not on entitlement, but on contribution. Specifically, their contribution to their community and to helping others in need. The trust establishes 3 individual funds, James explained. Each child may receive distributions from their fund when they demonstrate meaningful acts of service or generosity to those outside the family. The more significant the contribution, the larger the potential distribution. Catherine's eyes widened. You're making us perform charity work to get our inheritance? Like we're children who need to earn an allowance? Not at all, I replied calmly. I'm aligning my legacy with my values. Throughout my life, I've believed that privilege comes with responsibility, that having means carries an obligation to help those with less. I taught you those values, or at least I tried to. Now I'm structuring my estate to reflect them. Michael leaned forward. And who decides what qualifies as meaningful contribution? You? James? This is completely subjective and unenforceable. Actually, James interjected, the trust establishes an independent 3-person committee to evaluate requests for distributions. Their decisions must be unanimous and based on documented evidence of service. Bernard Bergman was frowning at the document. This is highly unusual. Most family trusts distribute based on objective criteria: time intervals, age milestones, specific needs. Most families haven't experienced what we have, I said quietly. David spoke for the first time. What if we contest this? What if we challenge the trust? James slid another document across the table. In that event, the alternate will come into effect. It's quite simple. Each of Ms. Wilson's children receives $1 with the statement that this is not an oversight but a deliberate decision based on their actions following her accident. The remainder of the estate would go to the National Teachers Foundation to establish scholarships for underprivileged students. The silence that followed was profound. My children were finally confronting the consequences of their actions, not just financially, but in the revelation of how fundamentally they had damaged our relationship. I don't want to disinherit you, I said into the silence. I want my legacy to reflect what I've always believed, that wealth without values corrupts, but wealth guided by values uplifts. This trust gives you the opportunity to reconnect with the values your father and I tried to instill. Bernard Bergman cleared his throat. My clients need time to review these documents and consider their position. Of course, James agreed. However, I should note that the trust is already established and funded. The alternate will has been properly executed and witnessed. Both would withstand legal challenge, especially given the documentation we have of the circumstances that led to their creation. The legal posturing continued for another half hour, with Bernard Bergman raising technical questions that James answered with professional precision. Throughout, my children remained largely silent, processing the reality that their inheritance was no longer guaranteed, at least not in the form they had expected. As the meeting concluded, Bernard Bergman and James stepped out to discuss procedural matters, leaving me momentarily alone with my children. The conference room felt suddenly too small, the air heavy with unspoken emotions. Catherine was the first to speak. You really think this will change anything? Making us jump through hoops for money that should be ours by right? It's not about the money, Catherine, I replied gently. It's about who you become in the process of earning it. Michael shook his head. This is manipulative and controlling. You're using your estate to force us to live by your values. No, Michael. I'm using my estate to encourage you to rediscover the values you once held before money became your primary concern. I looked directly at him. When you were 12, you organized a neighborhood fundraiser for your classmate who couldn't afford cancer treatments. You raised over $2,000 selling lemonade and washing cars. That boy's family was able to travel to a specialized hospital because of you. What happened to that, Michael? He had no answer, but something flickered in his eyes. A brief recognition of a self long forgotten. David remained quiet, his gaze fixed on the table. I love you all, I said, rising to leave. That has never changed and never will. My home and my heart remain open to you. But my assets will serve the values that have guided my life, one way or another. The choice of how is now yours. As Margaret helped me gather my things, David suddenly looked up. The letters, he said, the ones you tried to give us at dinner. Do you still have them? Of course, I replied, surprised by the question. They're at home. He nodded slowly. I'd like to read mine now if that's okay. It was the first genuine reaching out from any of my children since this ordeal began. A small opening, but significant. I'll send it to you, I promised. As we left the conference room, I felt neither triumph nor vindication, only a profound sadness mixed with quiet hope. Whatever happened next, whether they contested the will, embraced the trust's conditions, or simply walked away, I had stood my ground and honored my principles. In the elevator descending to the lobby, Margaret squeezed my hand. You were magnificent, she said softly. I feel empty, I admitted. Like I've lost them, no matter how this resolves. James, ever practical, offered a different perspective. You've given them something important, Charlotte. A choice. And sometimes, having to make a difficult choice is exactly what people need to find their way back to themselves. Outside, the March air held a hint of spring, a reminder that even after the hardest winters, renewal remains possible. As we drove away from the office, I found myself wondering which path my children would choose and whether our family might someday find its way to a new kind of relationship built on genuine respect rather than financial expectation. I couldn't know then how each would respond to the trust's challenge, or that the seeds planted in that conference room would eventually yield results I never anticipated. I only knew that I had finally spoken my truth, set clear boundaries, and created a legacy that reflected my deepest values, regardless of how my children chose to receive it. 2 weeks passed after the meeting with no word from my children. I sent David his letter as promised, but received no acknowledgement. The silence was deafening, filling my home with the heavy absence of family connection. Spring arrived in earnest, and I channeled my energy into my garden, planting, weeding, and nurturing new life from soil that had lain dormant all winter. Margaret called daily, her concern evident. Have you heard anything? She asked each time, and each time I gave her the same answer. They need time, I replied, though privately I wondered if the damage was irreparable. Had my stand for principles cost me my family? On a mild April morning, I was on my knees in the garden, coaxing early peas up their trellis, when a shadow fell across the soil. I looked up to find David standing awkwardly at the edge of the garden plot, hands thrust deep in his pockets. Mom, he said, his voice uncertain. Can we talk? We sat on the patio furniture Robert had built decades ago, 2 mugs of tea steaming between us. David looked thinner than I remembered, dark circles under his eyes suggesting restless nights. I read, Your letter, he finally said. 4 times, actually. I waited, giving him space to continue at his own pace. You wrote about the summer I was 10, when Dad lost his job and we almost lost the house. His eyes drifted to the garden. You said that was when you knew what kind of man I would become. I nodded, remembering the words I'd written. You emptied your piggy bank, every penny you'd saved for that bike you wanted. You put it all in an envelope and left it on our dresser with a note that said, For the house. David's eyes glistened. I'd forgotten that. I never did, I said softly. It wasn't the money. It was perhaps $30 in coins. It was the heart behind it, the willingness to give up something you wanted for someone you loved. Your letter asked what happened to that boy. His voice cracked slightly. I've been asking myself the same question for 2 weeks. What followed was the most honest conversation I'd had with any of my children in years. David admitted that Michael had been the driving force behind the plan to take control of my finances, but acknowledged his own culpability in going along with it. He spoke of professional disappointments, financial pressures, and the subtle but persistent influence of comparing himself to more affluent friends. I think somewhere along the way, I started believing that success was measured by what you own rather than who you are, he confessed. And when we realized how valuable your house had become, It felt like a solution to problems I didn't want to admit I had. His honesty was both painful and healing, a lancing of wounds that had festered too long in silence. "Have you spoken to Michael or Catherine?" I asked. David shook his head. "Not really. Michael's furious about the trust. He's still considering legal action, though Mr. Bergman apparently told him the chances of success are minimal." He hesitated. "Catherine's position is complicated. She's angry, but I think she's also ashamed, though she'd never admit it." "And you?" I asked gently. "Where do you stand now?" He looked directly at me for the first time since arriving. "I don't care about the money anymore, Mom. I care that I betrayed every value you and Dad taught me. I care that I almost destroyed our relationship for a payout that wouldn't have made me any happier in the long run." His words were like a balm to my wounded heart. Not because they absolved the hurt, but because they acknowledged it honestly. "The irony," he continued with a sad smile, "is that after reading your letter, I started volunteering at the community center downtown. Not for the trust, but because I needed to remember who I used to be. And it's been the most meaningful thing I've done in years." Before he left that day, David helped me finish planting the garden. His presence beside me in the soil felt symbolic, a return to roots, a reconnection with fundamental values. As we worked, he shared more about his volunteer work teaching computer skills to seniors and recent immigrants. The animation in his face as he described helping an elderly man video chat with his grandchildren for the first time spoke volumes about his rediscovery of meaning beyond material wealth. David's visit marked the beginning of a slow, careful reconciliation, at least with one of my children. He came regularly after that, sometimes to help with household projects, sometimes just to share a meal or conversation. We didn't always discuss the trust or the conflict, but its presence remained between us, acknowledged but no longer defining our relationship. Michael was a different story. In late May, James called to inform me that Michael had decided not to pursue legal action against the trust, but had made it clear he considered the conditions manipulative and controlling. He would neither participate in the trust's requirements nor maintain regular contact with me unless I reversed my decision. "He's essentially boycotting the relationship," James explained, his voice heavy with regret. "I'm sorry, Charlotte." The news hurt deeply but didn't surprise me. Of my 3 children, Michael had always been the most like me, stubborn, principled, and unwilling to concede a position once taken. I recognized in his refusal the same determination that had led me to create the trust in the first place. Catherine's response emerged in a typically Catherine manner, strategic and measured. In early June, she arrived unannounced on a Sunday afternoon, impeccably dressed and carrying a folder of newspaper clippings and printouts. "I'm not here to apologize," she announced, brushing past me into the living room. "I'm here to comply with the terms of the trust." She spread the materials across my coffee table, documentation of her recent charitable activities, including joining the board of a local domestic violence shelter, organizing a fundraiser for childhood literacy, and establishing a mentoring program for young women in business. "I've calculated that these contributions should qualify for at least a partial distribution," she stated, her tone businesslike. "I've submitted copies to James and the trust committee as required." I sat beside her, studying not the documents, but her face. "Why these particular causes, Catherine?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She'd prepared for a discussion of logistics, not motivation. "They're reputable organizations with tax-exempt status," she replied. "The trust stipulations require—" "I'm not asking about qualifications," I interrupted gently. "I'm asking why. These causes matter to you personally." Her professional facade faltered momentarily. "The literacy program," she began, then stopped, collecting herself. "When David was struggling to read in 2nd grade, you spent every evening with him, creating those ridiculous flashcards with cartoon characters. I remember watching you, how patient you were, how you never made him feel less than brilliant. even when he was frustrated. The memory hung between us, a glimpse of the daughter who still remembered being a child in a loving family. "And the domestic violence shelter?" I prompted. Catherine's eyes darted away. "One of my college roommates." She stopped, then continued more quietly. "She had to escape an abusive boyfriend our junior year. She had nowhere to go until a shelter took her in. I never forgot that." In that moment, I saw beyond Catherine's polished exterior to the person beneath, someone who had indeed absorbed the values I'd tried to instill, even if she'd buried them beneath ambition and materialism. "The trust isn't about checking boxes, Catherine," I said carefully. "It's about reconnecting with the part of yourself that understands wealth as responsibility, not just privilege." "I'm not David," she replied, a defensive edge returning to her voice. "I'm not going to have some dramatic epiphany and suddenly become a different person. This is who I am, Mom. Practical, results-oriented, and yes, interested in my inheritance. But that doesn't mean I don't also care about making a difference." Her honesty, though less emotional than David's, was refreshing. Catherine had always dealt in observable realities rather than emotional abstractions. Perhaps her approach to the trust, pragmatic engagement rather than heartfelt transformation, was authentic to who she was. "I'm not asking you to become someone else," I assured her. "Just to rediscover parts of yourself that got lost along the way." She gathered her materials with characteristic efficiency. "The trust committee will review my submission. If there are issues with my documentation, I'll address them." She paused at the door. "This doesn't mean I agree with what you did, but I can work within the framework you've created." After she left, I sat in my garden until sunset, contemplating my children's divergent responses. David had found meaning in the process regardless of financial reward. Catherine had approached it as a transaction, but revealed genuine connection to her chosen causes. And Michael had rejected the entire premise, unwilling to participate in what he viewed as manipulation. All three reactions reflected aspects of their personalities, and perhaps aspects of how Robert and I had raised them. The trust hadn't created these differences, it had merely illuminated them. That evening, I called James to update him on Catherine's visit. "She's submitted quite impressive documentation," he confirmed. "The committee will review it this week. But Charlotte, there's something else you should know." He paused, and I heard papers shuffling through the phone. "Michael has donated anonymously to 3 different organizations in the past month, substantial amounts. He specifically requested no acknowledgement and no connection to the Wilson name." The revelation stunned me. "How did you find out?" "One of the trust committee members serves on the board of the children's hospital that received the largest donation. She recognized the circumstances as matching our criteria and made discreet inquiries." "Did Michael know she would discover this?" "I don't believe so," James replied. "He seems to be intentionally avoiding any appearance of participating in the trust's requirements. But the fact remains, he's engaged in exactly the kind of meaningful giving the trust was designed to encourage." I sat with this information, feeling a complex mixture of hope and sadness. Michael was living the values I hoped to promote but refusing to acknowledge our connection in the process. His pride, another trait he inherited from me, wouldn't allow him to appear to yield to the trust's conditions, even as his actions aligned with its purpose. Summer progressed with this new family dynamic, David visiting regularly, Catherine engaging pragmatically with the trust's requirements, and Michael maintaining his distance while anonymously continuing his charitable giving. It wasn't the reconciliation I had imagined, but it was a kind of resolution, each child finding their own path in response to the boundary I had drawn. The trust committee approved distribution requests from both David and Catherine, though in different amounts reflecting the committee's assessment of their contributions. Michael, maintaining his boycott, neither requested nor received distributions despite his qualifying donations. As my hip regained full strength and the garden yielded its summer harvest, I found a measure of peace with the imperfect healing of my family. Some wounds were mending slowly, others remained open, and some had formed scars that would always mark our relationships, visible reminders of painful truths we could never unknow about each other. But beneath those scars, something essential remained intact, the foundation of love that had formed long before money and property entered our conversations. It was to that foundation I continued to appeal, hoping that time and consistency would eventually bring even Michael back to the table. What I didn't anticipate was how events beyond any of our control would accelerate that process, forcing us all to confront what truly mattered in ways none of us could have predicted or prepared for. The call came on a sweltering August evening as I was watering my garden. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across my flourishing tomato plants and bean trellises. When my phone rang, I almost didn't answer, thinking it might be another solicitation. Something made me check the screen. Catherine's name glowed back at me. "Mom!" Her voice was tight, controlled, but with an undercurrent of panic I'd never heard before. "It's Michael. There's been an accident." The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. "How bad?" "Bad," she replied simply. "He's at Memorial. They're taking him into surgery now." I don't remember much about the drive to the hospital. Margaret came immediately when I called, insisting on driving. I sat in the passenger seat, my mind racing through terrible possibilities while my hands twisted the strap of my purse. The garden hose was still running when we left, a detail that seemed both insignificant and bizarrely important, as my eldest child's life hung in the balance. The hospital waiting room held Catherine, her husband Paul, and David, who rose immediately when he saw me and enveloped me in a tight embrace. The gesture, so natural yet so recently rare between us, caught me off guard, and I found myself clinging to him. "What happened?" I asked when I could speak. "Car accident," Catherine answered, her professional composure showing cracks. "He was driving home from work. A truck ran a red light and T-boned his car on the driver's side. The paramedics had to cut him out." "How serious?" Margaret asked the question I couldn't form. "Multiple injuries," David said quietly. "Internal bleeding, broken ribs, collapsed lung. They're not making any promises." The stark reality of mortality crashed through all the barriers our family conflict had erected. In that moment, nothing mattered but Michael's survival. Not money, not property, not past hurts or future inheritance. I sank into a chair, struck by the terrible clarity that comes with crisis. Everything we'd fought about was ultimately meaningless, compared to the precious, fragile gift of life itself. Hours passed in that liminal space of hospital waiting rooms, where time stretches and compresses unpredictably. Catherine paced, making calls to Michael's office and his ex-wife to inform their daughter, who was away at college. David sat silently beside me, occasionally squeezing my hand. Paul and Margaret made coffee runs and fielded questions from the nurses who came periodically with non-updates that told us only that Michael was still in surgery. Around midnight, a tired-looking surgeon in wrinkled scrubs approached. "Wilson? Family?" We all stood, a united front for perhaps the first time in over a year. "He's stabilized," the surgeon said, and I felt my knees weaken with relief. "The next 24 hours will be critical. We've repaired the internal bleeding, reinflated the collapsed lung, and set 3 broken ribs. He has a severe concussion and significant bruising, but no spinal injuries, which is frankly remarkable given the impact." "When can we see him?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "He'll be in recovery for at least another hour, then ICU. Immediate family only, 2 at a time, 10 minutes maximum." The surgeon's eyes were kind but firm. "He won't be conscious, and he'll be on a ventilator until we're confident he can breathe reliably on his own." After the surgeon left, Catherine turned to me, her expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "You should go first, Mom. With David. I'll wait for the next rotation." Her deference, so unlike the Catherine who had been jockeying for position and control for months, touched me deeply. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "He'd want you there, even if he's too stubborn to admit it." When David and I were finally allowed into the ICU, I was unprepared for the sight of my strong, confident son rendered so vulnerable by machines and tubes. His face was swollen and bruised, barely recognizable. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator provided the only soundtrack to the dimly lit room. I approached cautiously, as if afraid my presence might somehow disturb the precarious balance keeping him alive. Gently, I touched his hand, the only part of him that seemed unmarked by the accident. "Michael," I whispered, though I knew he couldn't hear me. "I'm here. Mom's here." David stood at the foot of the bed, his face pale with shock. I've never seen him look so— "I know," I said, unable to complete the thought either. For 10 minutes, we stood vigil in that sterile room, the beeping monitors and mechanical breathing creating a surreal backdrop to the simple, devastating reality. My child was fighting for his life, and all the conflicts that had consumed us mere hours ago had evaporated into meaninglessness. When the nurse gently informed us our time was up, I leaned down to kiss Michael's forehead, a gesture I hadn't made since he was a teenager. "Fight, Michael," I whispered. "We're all waiting for you." The night stretched endlessly. None of us went home. Catherine and Paul took their turn in the ICU, then returned looking shaken. We camped in the waiting room, accepting blankets from kind nurses, dozing fitfully in uncomfortable chairs. By morning, Michael's ex-wife Lisa had arrived with their daughter Jessica, a sophomore in college who looked so much like her father that my heart clenched at the sight of her. The family circle expanded and contracted throughout the day as friends, and colleagues arrived with food and support. Michael's condition remained critical but stable, that maddeningly vague phrase that tells you both everything and nothing. By evening, Catherine had set up a detailed communication system to keep everyone informed while minimizing disruptions to the hospital staff. David had taken over coordinating food and practical support. Lisa focused on Jessica, who was clearly in shock. And I simply tried to be present, to hold the emotional center for a family suddenly reunited by crisis. It was during the second night, during my ICU visit with Catherine, that Michael first showed signs of consciousness. A slight movement of fingers, a flutter of eyelids. The nurse cautioned us not to expect too much. Patients often drift in and out after trauma. But when his fingers definitely curled around mine in response to my voice, something broke open inside me. "He can hear you," the nurse confirmed. "Keep talking to him. Familiar voices help orient patients coming out of sedation." So I talked. About mundane things, the garden, a bird's nest on my porch, a funny story Margaret had told me. Catherine joined in, describing Jessica's new haircut. Updates from his office. We carefully avoided any mention of our conflicts, focusing only on connection and comfort. By the third day, Michael was breathing on his own, the ventilator replaced with a simple oxygen cannula. He drifted in and out of lucidity, sometimes recognizing us, sometimes lost in the fog of medication and concussion. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, upgrading his condition to serious but stable. It was on the 5th day that he was fully conscious enough for real conversation. I was alone with him during my afternoon visit, Catherine having stepped out to take an important call. "Mom?" His voice was raspy from the ventilator tube, barely audible. "I'm here," I said, squeezing his hand gently. "Don't try to talk too much." He swallowed painfully. "Need to say something." I leaned closer. "Whatever it is can wait until you're stronger." "No." The determination I knew so well flashed in his eyes. "Might not get another chance." He took a labored breath. "Was wrong. About everything." Tears filled my eyes. "Michael, please." "Let me finish." His fingers tightened weakly around mine. When they were cutting me out of the car, I wasn't thinking about the house or money or the trust. I was thinking, I never got to tell Mom I was sorry. The simple confession, delivered in that broken voice from a hospital bed, held more healing power than any legal agreement or formal reconciliation could have achieved. In the face of mortality, all our petty conflicts had been revealed for what they truly were. "I know, sweetheart," I whispered, using the endearment I hadn't spoken since he was small. "I know." "The donations," he continued, each word clearly an effort. "I made them because they mattered. Not for the trust. Because it was right." "I know that too," I assured him, stroking his bruised hand. "James told me. I was so proud of you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Still stubborn." "Like mother. Like son," I replied, my own smile wobbling with unshed tears. In that moment, we found our way back to each other, not through legal documents or conditions or formal apologies, but through the recognition of our shared humanity and fragility. All the arguments about housing and assets seemed laughable now, faced with the stark reality that we had nearly lost each other in a more permanent way than any estrangement could have accomplished. Michael's recovery progressed steadily after that breakthrough. Within 2 weeks, he was moved to a regular room. By the end of the month, he was discharged to a rehabilitation facility to continue his physical therapy. Throughout this time, our family maintained its newfound unity, the crisis having burned away the superficial conflicts to reveal the bedrock of connection beneath. Catherine, surprisingly, was the one who suggested family counseling. "We need to address what happened," she said during a family meeting in Michael's hospital room. "Not just sweep it under the rug because we're relieved Michael's alive." David agreed immediately. "We can't go back to how things were before Mom's accident or before Michael's. We need to build something better." Michael, still weak but growing stronger daily, looked to me. "Mom? What do you think?" "I think," I said carefully, "that we have a rare opportunity to start over with greater wisdom than we had before. I'd like to take it." The counseling began while Michael was still in rehabilitation. Weekly sessions with Dr. Harriet Chen, a family therapist specializing in estate-related conflicts. Those early sessions were painful, raw, and brutally honest. My children expressed resentments and fears I'd never fully understood. I shared hurts and disappointments I'd previously kept to myself. "What I hear," Dr. Chen observed during our third session, "is that this conflict was never really about money or property. It was about recognition, respect, and security, emotional needs that became entangled with financial matters." She was right, of course. Michael admitted that his aggressive approach to my finances stemmed partly from anxiety about his own financial setbacks after his divorce. Catherine acknowledged that her focus on selling my house reflected her belief that her professional success gave her decision-making authority. David confessed that he had gone along with their plans partly out of a long-time pattern of deferring to his older siblings. For my part, I recognized how my independence had sometimes manifested as an unwillingness to involve my children in legitimate concerns about aging. My fear of becoming a burden had created distance that they had filled with assumptions and projections. Slowly, painfully, we rebuilt, not the uncomplicated relationships of the past, but something more mature and resilient. By the time autumn painted my garden in bronze and gold, Michael had recovered enough to join us for Sunday dinners. These gatherings, now held weekly, became our family's ritual of reconnection. The most profound moment of healing came unexpectedly, at one such dinner in late October. Michael, now walking with just a cane, arrived with a large envelope tucked under his arm. After the meal, as we sat in the living room with coffee, he cleared his throat. I've been thinking a lot about legacy, he began, his voice stronger now but forever changed by his injuries, about what we leave behind and what it really means. He removed several documents from the envelope and handed them to me. These are the bylaws for a new foundation I'm establishing, the Michael Wilson Family Service Foundation. It's designed to support organizations that bridge generational gaps, programs that connect seniors with disadvantaged youth, heritage projects that preserve family and community histories, that sort of thing. I scanned the papers, noting the significant seed funding he had committed, and the governance structure that included positions for family members. The accident changed everything for me, he continued, addressing all of us now. It made me realize we'd lost sight of what's important. Mom, your trust tried to teach us that, but I was too stubborn to listen. He took a deep breath. I'd like to request that the Wilson Family Legacy Trust dissolve and transfer its assets to this foundation. Instead, we'll all serve on the board, making decisions together about how to create a meaningful legacy that honors both Mom and Dad. The proposal was breathtaking in its elegance, acknowledging the wisdom behind my original trust while creating a vehicle for collaborative family governance rather than individual incentives. It was everything I had hoped to achieve, transformed by Michael's own journey into something even more powerful. I think it's brilliant, I said, emotion making my voice unsteady. David and Catherine voiced immediate approval as well, both clearly moved by their brother's transformation. As the discussion turned to practical details of the transition, I sat back, watching my 3 children engage in passionate conversation about impact metrics and community needs rather than asset distributions and personal benefit. In Michael's brush with mortality, we had all found a perspective that no amount of legal maneuvering or financial incentives could have provided. That evening, after they had all left, I stood in my garden under a canopy of stars, reflecting on the extraordinary journey we had traveled. From my broken hip to Michael's near-fatal accident, from manipulation to reconciliation, from material focus to meaningful legacy, the path had been neither straight nor easy. Yet standing there, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the broken places that had allowed the light to enter, for the painful truths that had ultimately set us free. The legacy I would leave behind now was far greater than property or investments. It was the restoration of a family that had nearly lost its way, but found its heart again in the face of what truly matters. What none of us could know then was how this renewed foundation would be tested one final time, in a reckoning that would bring our journey full circle and reveal whether the lessons learned had truly taken root. 6 months after Michael's accident, as spring once again brought renewal to my garden, I received unexpected news of my own during a routine medical checkup. What I had dismissed as fatigue from an overly busy winter was diagnosed as a heart condition requiring immediate intervention. Mitral valve regurgitation, my cardiologist explained, pointing to images on her computer screen. It's quite advanced. I'm surprised you haven't experienced more symptoms. What are the treatment options? I asked, practical as always despite the shock. At your age and with this severity, we recommend valve replacement surgery. There are risks, of course, but leaving it untreated poses greater dangers. I sat in her office, absorbing the reversal of circumstances. After a year focused on my children's behaviors and attitudes, I was now the vulnerable one facing mortality. The surgery was scheduled for the following week. That evening, I called my children together. Watching their faces as I shared the diagnosis, I witnessed the mirror image of my own fear when Michael had been injured, that terrible, helpless love that can do nothing but wait and hope. The roles had completely reversed. Now they would be the ones in the waiting room receiving updates from surgeons, praying for good outcomes. I'll be moving in with you during recovery, Michael announced immediately, no hint of the previous year's power struggles in his voice. My condo is all on one level, no stairs to worry about. I've already researched the top cardiac surgeons, Catherine added, her tablet open to medical review sites. Your doctor is excellent, but I want to make sure we've explored all options. David, ever practical, asked, "What can we do to prepare your house for when you're ready to return?" "You'll need some modifications, at least temporarily." Their immediate, unhesitating support brought tears to my eyes. There were no calculations of burden or inheritance, no subtle power plays or manipulation, just three adults rallying around, their mother with genuine concern and love. "Thank you," I said simply. "I'm not afraid of the surgery, but I am afraid of leaving things unsaid." I looked at each of them in turn. "No matter what happens in that operating room, I want you to know that I'm deeply proud of who you've become, not just your accomplishments, but the people you are. Especially after this past year." Catherine, rarely emotional, wiped away a tear. "We're going to get through this, Mom, all of us together." The day of surgery arrived with crystalline clarity, one of those perfect spring mornings that make you grateful simply to be alive. As the pre-op nurses prepared me, my children remained by my side, each offering comfort in their characteristic ways. Michael's steady presence, Catherine's meticulous questioning of medical staff, David's gentle humor, all creating a fortress of love around me. Just before they wheeled me into the operating room, I squeezed each of their hands. "Remember," I said, my voice stronger than I felt, "whatever happens, the most important inheritance I leave isn't money or property. It's the love we've rediscovered." The next thing I remembered was the recovery room, the disoriented emergence from anesthesia, and the gradual awareness of success I had survived. The surgery had gone well. The damaged valve had been replaced, and while recovery would be lengthy, the prognosis was excellent. When I was lucid enough for visitors, my children entered my room together, their relieved expressions telling me everything I needed to know about the worry they had endured while I was unconscious. "The surgeon said you have the heart of a much younger woman," David reported, grinning. "Though I could have told him that without cutting you open." Over the next week in the hospital, I observed my children working together seamlessly, coordinating visits, consulting with doctors, planning for my discharge and recovery. There was no jockeying for control, no underlying agenda, just shared purpose and mutual respect. As promised, I went to Michael's condo for the initial weeks of recovery. His one-story home with wide doorways proved ideal for my temporarily limited mobility. Catherine arranged for a part-time nurse and physical therapist. David took charge of bringing items from my house that would make me comfortable and checking on my garden in my absence. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after surgery, I sat on Michael's patio enjoying the sunshine when he joined me with 2 cups of tea. "I've been thinking," he said, settling into the chair beside me, "about what you said before your surgery, about the most important inheritance not being money or property." "Yes?" I prompted when he paused. It reminded me of something Dad used to say. When I'd get caught up in comparing myself to wealthier friends or coveting the newest whatever, he'd tell me, "The only wealth that matters is what remains when all material possessions are stripped away." Michael smiled at the memory. I didn't understand it then. I do now. I nodded, remembering Robert's wisdom that had so often countered my more practical nature. "Your father understood something fundamental about life that took me much longer to learn." "The accident taught me that," Michael admitted. "And then your surgery drove it home. All the fighting over your house and investment seems insane now. What does any of it matter compared to having you here with us?" The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Catherine and David, each bearing contributions to the dinner we'd planned. As we sat together that evening, still healing, but whole in all the ways that truly mattered, I realized we had come full circle from where our journey began. 6 weeks after surgery, I returned to my own home, now modified with temporary accommodations similar to those after my hip surgery. The garden had flourished under David's care, and the house felt welcoming rather than isolating. especially with the regular rotation of family members checking in, bringing meals, or simply visiting. It was during one such visit, with all three children gathered for Sunday dinner, that I broached a subject I'd been considering throughout my recovery. "I've asked James to make some changes to my estate plan," I announced as we lingered over dessert. "I'd like to discuss them with you." Their expressions showed momentary tension, a flash of the old anxiety about inheritance and control, but it quickly dissolved into attentive interest. "The Wilson Family Legacy Trust has served its purpose," I explained. "As Michael suggested before my surgery, I'm dissolving it in favor of the foundation you've established. Most of my assets will transfer there upon my death, with the understanding that the foundation will continue the work you've already begun." They nodded, this being largely what we had already discussed. "As for this house," I continued, touching on what had been the initial source of conflict, "I've decided not to make any predetermined arrangements. When the time comes that I can no longer live here safely, whether due to health or simply choice, we'll make that decision together, as a family. Until then, it remains my home." "That sounds perfect, Mom," David said, and his siblings voiced their agreement. "There's one more thing," I added. "A personal bequest to each of you." I handed them each an envelope, not unlike those they had refused at our difficult dinner nearly a year before. "These are letters describing what I'm leaving specifically to each of you. Not monetary gifts, but personal ones. I'd like you to read them now if you're willing." They opened the envelopes with reverent care, so different from the suspicion that might have greeted such a gesture months ago. Michael was the first to react, a soft "oh" escaping him as he read. Catherine pressed her fingers to her lips, clearly moved. David simply nodded, understanding blooming across his face. "To Michael," I explained for the benefit of the others, "I'm leaving your father's pocket watch and his collection of first edition novels. You shared his analytical mind and his secret love of literature." Michael held the letter carefully. "I used to sneak into his study to look at those books. I didn't think anyone knew." To Catherine, "My mother's jewelry and my teaching journals from 30 years in the classroom. You have her determination and my passion for mentoring others, though you express it differently." Catherine nodded, blinking rapidly. "I always wondered what you wrote in those journals. And to David, your father's woodworking tools and my garden journals. You inherited his gentle hands and my nurturing spirit." David smiled. "The garden has been my therapy this past year. I'd be honored." "These aren't just sentimental gifts," I clarified. "They're recognitions of who you truly are, beyond careers, or bank accounts or addresses. They're acknowledgments of the qualities I've always seen in each of you, even when circumstances temporarily obscured them." As we sat there together, a family broken and remade, damaged and healed, I felt a sense of completion. The painful journey of the past year had stripped away pretenses and forced us to confront difficult truths, but in doing so, it had revealed something precious that might otherwise have remained buried. "I've been thinking about dollar bills," I said, drawing curious looks from my children. "About how I once considered leaving each of you just $1 in my will." They shifted uncomfortably at this reminder of how close we had come to permanent estrangement. "But I've realized something," I continued. "A dollar bill carries value not because of the paper it's printed on, but because of the shared agreement about what it represents. In the same way, inheritance isn't valuable because of the assets transferred, but because of what it represents about our connection to each other and to those who came before us." Michael leaned forward. "That's why your trust conditions felt so wrong to me initially. They seemed to place conditions on that connection." "And I see now that you were partly right," I acknowledged. "The trust was an imperfect solution to a complex problem, but it served its purpose. It forced us to examine what truly mattered." "The irony," Catherine observed with a wry smile, "is that we're all probably going to end up doing more charitable work through the foundation than we would have under the trust's requirements. But it feels entirely different when it's our choice rather than a condition. That's the essence of legacy, I said. Not controlling from beyond, but inspiring those who remain to carry forward what was meaningful. That evening, after my children had gone home, I sat in my garden watching fireflies emerge in the twilight. The journey from that hospital room where I had overheard my children's plans to this moment of genuine reconciliation had been neither direct nor easy. It had required confrontation, boundary setting, painful honesty, and ultimately, the perspective that only facing mortality can bring. 6 months later, fully recovered and stronger than before, I hosted the first official family meeting of the Michael Wilson Family Service Foundation at my home. The dining room table was covered with grant proposals, strategic plans, and impact reports. My children and I, along with Michael's daughter Jessica, who had joined the board, engaged in passionate discussion about where our resources could make the most meaningful difference. As I looked around that table, I saw something far more valuable than any financial inheritance I could have left them. I saw 3 adults who had found their way back to the values that truly mattered, who had transformed potential division into unified purpose, who had learned that true wealth lies not in what you own but in how you love. The $1 inheritance that had once been my threatened consequence had evolved into something neither punishment nor reward, but transformation. My children had inherited something far more precious than money or property. They had reclaimed the best parts of themselves and each other, and in the end, that was the only legacy that truly mattered. When I finally sit across from my children, in my lawyer's office 6 months after my accident to formalize the dissolution of the Wilson Family Legacy Trust and transfer of my estate to our foundation, there are no shocked faces, no bitterness or resentment, only shared purpose and genuine love. The journey that began with betrayal and resulted in each of them symbolically receiving $1 has culminated in them receiving everything that truly matters. Sometimes the greatest legacy we leave behind isn't what we give, but what we teach. And sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't measured in dollars, but in the wisdom gained through difficult lessons learned. Before we end, if this story touched you, make sure you're subscribed. Family conflicts over inheritance happen everywhere, but it's how we handle these challenges that defines us. Remember, the true value of legacy isn't in the assets transferred, but in the values transmitted. Thank you for joining me for this deeply personal story.